Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and I'm so glad you're here. Each week, you're going to find practical lessons here on the show about cueing, sequencing, and building the mindset of an empowered yoga teacher. My goal is to help you step into every class with the knowledge you need, the confidence to make your own decisions, and the ability to trust yourself as a teacher. Let's get started. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 415. I'm recording this on July 30th, 2026, and this will go live on August 3rd. So I wanted to just share with you, obviously you can't see me, but I am sitting in a really comfortable chair in my office, and it's just making me laugh because whenever I record the podcast, I sit at the desk, I sit up nice and tall. It's, I wouldn't say super comfortable, but it's not really supposed to be. I mean, I want my voice to be clear, and I think posture obviously has a lot to do with that. But I was just thinking today when I walked in here, why don't I sit in the comfortable chair? Because this is really more about having a conversation with you versus giving a presentation. And I can't even tell you how this has just transformed how I feel. And it feels much more conversational for me to just be sitting in this chair. So even though you can't see me, I want you to imagine that's what I'm doing. That's my posture for this conversation. So here we are. It's the end of July. We're heading into August. If you're listening to this episode in real time, you know what I'm talking about. And I wanted to just ask you, are you ready for your classes in September? Because you know what happens in September, right? September has more people, more beginners, more energy, more questions. It's just like January 1st. People are back from vacation, back from changing schedules, back from taking a mental break, and they're ready to hit the ground running. The kids are back to school. They might be taking on some personal self-education courses, things like that. Just the energy of September, as you know, is very much like January. And so what that means for us as yoga teachers is we need to be prepared for everything from beginners in the front row to people coming to the studio that have never been there before, who don't know where the mats are, don't know where the props are discombobulated from the second they step into the studio room, and they'll need help with mat placement and getting their props, things like that, and just more people in general. And so, what comes to your mind when you think about that sort of thing? I mean, how do you feel about your level of readiness to teach in scenarios like that? I mean, there's obviously a lot of technique that goes along with this type of situation, this moment in time, this time on the calendar. But there's also just the mental readiness, the feeling like I've got this. This is no problem. So I wanted to just bring that up for you to see, have you considered this? Have you thought of this? And what comes up for you when you think about teaching in these kinds of situations this time of year? So with that, let me shift to the next part of this conversation. And I wasn't actually planning on speaking on this, but I thought it would make for a really good piece of the podcast episode today. So I'm not only going to speak on it, I'm also going to include the links to the articles. Yesterday, as I was scrolling through TikTok, or maybe it was Instagram, I saw a post about an article a yoga teacher had written, and it was basically about the state of our industry with respect to Yoga Alliance, its impact on the industry, pay for yoga teachers, the CEO of Yoga Alliance and her pay, and whether or not there's fairness in our industry, whether or not there's support for yoga teachers from an industry level. i.e., from the organization that presumably is the organization for yoga teachers. And I use that term loosely because it's not like as yoga teachers, we really had a choice in who was going to be representing us. So I'm going to include the article link to Rebecca Sebastian's analysis, along with a review of her article, kind of a summary, which I actually thought was really good if you want sort of not really another perspective, but just a quick summary written by Yen Fang of the Yoga Edit. So both those links will be in the show notes. And I really encourage you to read them because, and you can look up Rebecca Sebastian on the social media there and see her speak on this article. And I found this interesting. Number one, because I think it was 3 or 4 episodes back, I did a whole deep dive into Yoga Alliance and what Yoga Alliance, I don't want to say what it means or what it's about, but my perspective on the appropriate framing of Yoga Alliance for yoga teachers. And I think that the framing is really what's critical because a lot of teachers, and I talked about this in the episode, go around and talk about being certified and they're equating certification with what Yoga Alliance does. And Yoga Alliance, by their own admission, does not certify anybody. And so I think at a top level, there's a real need for accurate articulation with respect to what is Yoga Alliance actually doing. And it's kind of interesting because in both of these articles, I mean, certainly Rebecca's article is the source. She talks about the CEO of Yoga Alliance and her pay, which I think was somewhere around 500K annually, which was a raise from her initial pay, which was like 350. And how I believe it was in fiscal year 2024, Yoga Alliance went through a downsizing. But interestingly enough, and I want you to think about this, the organization originally had about 50 employees and they downsized to about 30. So I want you to just think for a moment that there is an organization that purportedly supports yoga teachers globally, yoga schools globally, and they only have 35 people doing it. Like that to me is just evidence that they are not set up from an infrastructure standpoint to do any kind of critical analysis, intensive support, anything. I mean, this is why I hear from teachers all the time that the anatomy training they received as part of their 200-hour training was insufficient, if at all even done. And the reason that this kind of thing happens is because there is no oversight done. And how could there be? There's about 35 people at Yoga Alliance and there are hundreds, I think the numbers in Yen's article talked about 100,000 yoga teachers, which I actually think is kind of low. I don't know how we would know. Actually, you could probably look on the Yoga Alliance website. Maybe there's a head count with respect to the listing of registered teachers. But the point is, in my view, 30 some odd people is not enough people, not enough infrastructure to actually make any reasonable impact on supporting yoga teachers, taking a look at the trainings that are happening, ensuring quality, facilitating functional conversation globally between yoga teachers and this organization. So I want you to take a look at these articles because I think it's important for you as a yoga teacher to have a sense of what's going on. Now, having said that, I want to also speak to one of the really core pieces of Rebecca's article, which is to say, critically, it is not reasonable that the CEO of Yoga Alliance, who never was a yoga teacher, she has nonprofit work experience, but is not a yoga teacher. And so Rebecca's premise is, what are we doing with an organization that supposedly represents yoga teachers that's run by someone who's not a yoga teacher and her compensation is over $500,000 annually, but yet yoga teachers are barely scraping by with barely making 50 bucks a class. And there were a lot of comments from teachers, and I know this because I've had these conversations with teachers. A lot of comments from teachers saying, what are you talking about, $50 a class? I make 25, I make 30. So I will say, in my personal experience, I have consistently experienced personally $50 a class as what I have been paid when I teach in a studio. But I didn't just teach in studios. I created my own teaching opportunities in other non-studio locations where I set the rate based on my experience and what I was going to be providing in that situation for that client. And so this leads me to just the last piece I want to say on this before we go to the main topic for today's episode. And that is, I want you to keep in mind there's sort of a number of parallel situations or parallel um, pieces, narratives, storylines going on in these articles. And I don't want you to get just drawn into the one storyline, which is how unfair is it that we continue to have an industry that underpays teachers, requires them to get training that is, in my view, in a lot of cases, just really, really expensive for teachers to take. And yet we have a CEO who's making, X amount of dollars, we'll call it 500 annually. And so there's this whole piece that Rebecca goes into that that's not fair. And I think that fairness is definitely part of the conversation, but what I don't want that whole angle to do is draw you into feeling like, woe is me. Why am I even bothering with this? In fact, some of the teachers, and I was really dismayed to see this, commented on Rebecca's social media post, I don't even teach for money. This is why I don't charge for my classes. And that to me is going way too far out into the ethosphere, or whatever we want to say, stratosphere, with a perception that yoga teaching should not be something that is charged for. Teachers shouldn't charge for what they do. I mean, this has been discussed for many years in social media, in conversations with teachers, where some teachers feel like there's a conflict. And we need to recognize that, number one, we're in the year of 2026. We're not in the year of some years past where people did things just for free. And sidebar, you can do pro bono work and also charge for what you do in other situations. And also, you should be, why should we say there's something inherent in yoga that should not compensate the teacher for the expertise that they are exhibiting when they teach their classes? And so I'm not even really going to entertain that particular perspective. If you have that perspective, more power to you. But I don't think that's where we want to go as an industry, to coach teachers that, well, they should just teach for free. But what I don't want you to do is throw up your hands and say, oh, well, this is so unfair. Why am I even bothering? There is a real practical component to teaching yoga that is connected to the financial aspect of doing it. And it is a very realistic understanding that I want you to have, which is $50 a class is probably what you're going to make. And that might even be on the high end if you teach just in studios. So just let that land for a minute. And if that does not land well for you, meaning you would love to teach full time, you would love to leave your full-time job to teach yoga full time, you need or want to make more money than you could possibly make, even if you taught 20 classes a week at $50 a class, like whatever your situation is, then instead of saying it's not fair that the CEO of Yoga Alliance makes X amount of dollars annually, wouldn't it make more sense for you to figure out how you can make more money? Right? This was exactly the position I was in when I taught for Baptiste Yoga. And I put all my eggs in that basket. I got whatever classes they offered me, and I wasn't making enough money to even pay my mortgage on my condo, let alone pay for expenses. So what did I do? Well, I started a personal chef business on the side. I took out a personal loan, which I would never recommend you do, but that's what I did. But the point is not that I took out a personal loan and the quality of that decision. It was me doing something to try to figure out how I was going to fix the problem of I wasn't making enough money just teaching for Baptiste. And so eventually what I did was I created a bunch of other teaching opportunities. I kept my personal chef business running because at this point I had quit my full-time job until my other non-studio teaching opportunities made me a piece of revenue, incoming revenue that could fill a gap. Anyway, I've talked about this in past episodes, but the point is that I'm trying to make is I don't want you to hear when you read these two articles that teaching yoga is for naught, that you should just throw up your hands. Because there are ways to make it work, but it just has to be a very practical conversation you have with yourself, an analysis you do with yourself and your own finances. A lot of the teachers that are out there in the world are teaching on the side while working full time. Some people are teaching and they're retired, so they have retirement income. Some teachers are teaching and they have a life partner who has the primary breadwinning income, right? Everybody's situation is going to be different. So, number one, I want you to start with, do I want to teach yoga and why? If you know the answers to those questions and you feel really passionate about teaching, there's no reason why any of this conversation about the salary of the CEO of Yoga Alliance and the teachers get paid about 50 bucks a class, there's no reason why that should dissuade you. It's all information that should empower you to sit down and have a real practical conversation with yourself about how can I make this work for me? I mean, you can take my situation right now as a perfect example. You know, from month to month, I have very little control over how many yoga teachers enroll in my programs. And so I don't have a repeatable way that I can predict my month to month income. And this is very uncomfortable for me because if I want to pay my bills and I have my own bills that go with my own business, I need to have some sense of uh, what my sales are going to be for the month. And I don't have that. Some months I sell more programs than other months, but yet every day I am on social media providing free content. Every week I record a podcast episode, and you know that this is episode 415. So over 400 times, 400 weeks, I have shown up to provide free content in the form of this podcast. I am every week in touch with the people on my VIP email list. These are things I can control. And I know because when teachers do enroll in one of my programs, they always say, I've been following you on social media. I've been listening to your podcast. I appreciate the emails that you send out. So there is a connection there. But if I were to instead wake up every morning and just say, I have no way to know if I'm going to have any teachers enroll this week, therefore I'm just going to moan and groan about it and stomp my feet and say this is so unfair, what good does that do me? So this is part of like Stoic philosophy. It's like you are controlling what you can control because you know that there's a big element of things that you can't control. You can't control what the salary is of the CEO of Yoga Alliance and why you're even going to, other than being educated about it, let that interfere with what you're doing, to me, is fruitless. Now, yes, is there a whole arm of this conversation around advocacy for yoga teachers and having conversations at the top level in our industry about what is the kind of organization we want to represent us? Yes, there is a place, but for you as a yoga teacher, that is a separate pathway. If you are committed to teaching and you love teaching, then there is your own pathway where you are controlling the things you can control. So that's what I wanted to say on that. I don't know if you've heard about these articles, and I will again link them in the show notes. So the last thing I wanted to talk about, which is really kind of the teaching lesson of this conversation, is the idea of bringing themes of anatomy into your classes. And it's kind of interesting to me because 2 episodes ago, I did an episode on different things you can do with your signature sequence to just tweak it a little bit. So I presented 4 or 5 different little sequence pose transitions you can insert in your signature sequence. And that week I had a whole bunch, hundreds of downloads, much more than I typically have. And I sort of don't have a great handle on the data because my podcast platform doesn't give me great data, but I sense that that particular episode was part of the spike. And so this is sort of related to that topic and why I'm inspired to speak on this topic today, because it is sort of related. So maybe this will also generate a lot more listeners. So this idea of bringing anatomical themes into your classes, I want to just first say, this is not a conversation about going back to the drawing board and writing out a brand new sequence. This is about continuing to use your signature sequence and just teaching it with a different anatomical focus. And that, of course, will drive the cues that you use. So the magic of this is that you don't need to change anything. You can continue to go into your class, you can continue to use your signature sequence, and you get all the benefits of teaching that signature sequence. You remember it, you feel confident, you feel at ease, you feel like you trust what you're saying, you trust what you're doing, you trust that you know what comes next. Like you get all the benefits of using a signature sequence, but you get to tweak it a little bit. So let me share with you what that looks like. Now, if you've been connected with me for a while, I'm a big proponent of using a framework. Frameworks basically are a way that I share how-to content with you that allows you to make it your own, but gives you some structure that you can use, rather than what most trainings do, which is constantly just train to one thing. And then the teacher has to remember millions of different things. If I share a framework with you, you can go off and use it and apply it in however way you want for the teaching you're doing. So the framework here is around how to bring anatomy themes into your classes. So the first part of the framework, step 1, is identifying the theme. And the theme could be, I'm going to just give you 2 here to get you started. There could be more. So the examples I'm going to give you are having your theme be around a muscle group or a joint action. You could do both, but you could do one or the other. Step 2 of this framework is to identify the poses that have this action or use these muscles. And then step 3 is speak to this theme in your cues. And I'll also just add as a sidebar, of course, the sequence is going to reinforce this theme. So now you've got the full framework for how you're going to do this. You're going to identify the theme for this particular teaching of your signature sequence, muscle group or joint action. You're going to identify the poses that have this action or use these muscles, and then you're going to speak to them in your cues. So let me give you now some examples. So let's say you've got your signature sequence, and before you go in to teach the class, you say to yourself, okay, I want to have an anatomical theme for this particular episode of teaching this class, teaching this signature sequence. So I'm going to focus on external rotation of the hips and the shoulders. So the next thing you would do is think about your sequence through the lens of what poses have external hip rotation and external shoulder rotation. Okay, so now obviously This is where things may come up for you in terms of, I don't really have a good handle on the anatomy. So I don't want you to do this if you know that you don't understand the application of anatomy to movement. This is not the kind of thing to play around with, to pretend, to fake. But if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I would really like to be able to do that, well, then there's your answer. Now is the time to get that knowledge gap filled. Okay. And obviously, I can help you with that. So you look at your signature sequence, you identify poses that have hip and shoulder external rotation. And when you're going in to teach your class, remember, this is your signature sequence. You know it well. So this isn't something you need to write out a whole bunch of new notes for. You're just going to go into your class with the framework in mind. You're going to be teaching to hip external rotation and shoulder external rotation with more emphasis than you typically do. So think about squats. Think about poses like airplane, where you have shoulder external rotation. Think about poses like extended side angle with a half bind, where you have external shoulder rotation. Think about half moon, where you've got external hip rotation on the upper leg. So you're just basically looking at your signature sequence with a different lens. Another example would be muscles of the core. I love doing this one because it really dispels the myth that so many yoga teachers are purporting out there, which is the core, which is not true. The core is 4 different muscles: the rectus abdominis, the transversus abdominis, the inner oblique, and the outer oblique, and they do different things. And so when you learn anatomy and how to apply it to movement, you can speak to the core by speaking to collectively the core, speaking to the function of the individual muscles. And in this example, using your signature sequence and looking for opportunities to speak to muscles of the core. So for instance, when you're teaching twisting crescent lunge and twisting chair twist, or any twisting pose, laying on the ground, spinal twist, speaking to the obliques. When you have somebody standing in tree, speaking to the transversus abdominis. When you see someone is in an anterior pelvic tilt and you want them to be in a neutral pelvic position, speaking to the rectus abdominis. Right? So I want you to see what's coming up for you as you're hearing me talk in this way. If what's coming up for you is, oh man, I wish I had a better handle on that. Oh man, I hear what she's saying, but I don't really own how she's saying. I don't really own the information, right? This is a sign. You've got that anatomy learning gap. What are you going to do about it? Okay. The next example would be hip flexion and extension. So what if you used your signature sequence and you just focused on poses where you have hip flexion and hip extension? Like hip flexion gets a bad rap because a lot of people talk about tight hip flexors. But remember, tight hip flexors can sometimes be because the hip flexors are weak. So it's good to give people opportunities to strengthen their hip flexors. And guess what? You're not going to know who in your class has weak hip flexors or hip flexors that are sufficiently strong because you don't know anything about these people. So this is why when you're teaching, you want to have sort of this loose attachment to who's got what problem and just teach the class. Provide value. So what's an example of a pose where you would have people in hip flexion and they would be strengthening their hip flexors? So you have to know, well, what does strengthening hip flexors mean? Well, that means the hip flexors are concentrically contracting. Well, who are the hip flexors? So primarily the psoas and the rectus femoris. Okay, so a perfect example would be boat. When you bring people into boat pose, that is a great way for them to strengthen the hip flexors. And then the last example, and I love this one. I love them all, but I love this one. The last example is strengthening lateral hip stabilizers through a series of balancing poses. So what are the lateral hip stabilizers? First of all, what does lateral mean? Lateral means on the side. And what does hip stabilizers mean? So hip stabilizers refer to muscles that keep stability in the pelvis. I mean, you could make the case for hip, and I guess you could say in the hips as well. So what's the opposite of stabilizing muscles? Well, if you have a lack of hip stability, you're going to see a lot of play in the movement of the pelvis. You're going to see a lot of movement of the head of the femur in the acetabulum of the pelvis. You're going to see a lot of wonkiness in the standing leg and a balance, whether it's the knee joint or the ankle joint. You're not going to see a strong kinetic chain in that standing leg. So, what muscles are the hip stabilizers? Well, if the description of the group is lateral hip stabilizers, they're muscles on the outer hip. So what muscles are on the outer hip? On the side. So you've got your gluteus medius, your gluteus minimus, the TFL, and the IT band. So if you teach a series of balances that focus on lateral hip stabilization, you're going to be concentrically contracting those muscles. Why not tell them that? What a great opportunity for them to learn. And balancing poses, I mean, it could be anything. It could be tree, it could be eagle, it could be dancer's pose. Although in dancers, yeah, it could be dancer's pose. I mean, you've got the anterior pelvic tilt, but it still works. Standing hand to knee pose. Okay. So those are some examples to get you started and see what you think. Just pick one, give it a try, overlay it as a theme in your signature sequence, and let me know how it goes. So the last thing I want to just say before we wrap up is I want to go back to one of the first things I chatted about with you at the start of this episode, which was that first part of the conversation where I was speaking to September is, a month away if you're listening to this in real time, and your classes are going to be bigger. You're going to have more beginners. So do you feel prepared? And I want to get a little more detailed about what prepared can look like. And you're going to have some of your own feelings on this, but I want to give you sort of a head start. So, being really prepared as a yoga teacher can look like you're teaching a signature sequence that you love. You can teach it without notes. You can teach it by doing the walk and talk. You understand anatomy and how to apply it to movement. And you trust yourself as a teacher. I mean, to me, that description is just like chef's kiss. That is just a yoga teacher that is just rocking it. That is a yoga teacher that's, they're just going into their class and they're just feeling like, I trust what I'm doing. I'm not worried about what the head of Yoga Alliance is making. I'm, trusting what I'm doing. I know I'm making an impact. I know what I'm doing. I'm not looking for anybody's permission to do it in a particular way. Right? So, how does that land with you? Does that sound like a way of being that you want, that you desire? All right. So, in closing, the links to the articles are in the show notes. I'm going to also include a link to my ebook, so you can download that as well. That covers a whole bunch of different teaching topics. And I'll also include links to my 3 main programs in the show notes, because if this conversation sparked your interest in really getting on the path to improving as a teacher towards the goal maybe I just described, a goal that you have that you would describe in your own words, then take a look at those programs. I would say, generally speaking, the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator is probably the best place to start. But I also have a more extensive program, the Blueprint Learning Program, and I've also got one specifically around the mindset of a confident yoga teacher, and that's called the Mindset Method. Okay, that's it for this week. Thanks so much for listening to the end, and I'll chat with you next week on Conversations for Yoga Teachers. Namaste. Thanks so much for listening. Before you go, think about what stood out to you in today's episode. If something sparked a new idea or got you thinking differently about your teaching, feel free to send me a DM. I'd love to hear from you. And if you're ready to move forward as a teacher, I've created a few ways to support you. There's the Yoga Anatomy Accelerator, where you'll learn how to apply anatomy to cueing and sequencing. The Yoga Anatomy Blueprint Learning Program, my one-to-one program, where you'll get personalized support to develop into the teacher you truly want to be. And the Mindset Method, a program that will help you discover proven ways to feel more confident teaching. You'll find the links to each one of these programs on my website, barebonesyoga.com, and it's also in the link in my social media bio on TikTok or Instagram. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.